Oh, okay, good. I didn't know she had moved on, and that's a good excuse.
We both.
We both did. No wonder.
Well, I was at Aspen last week, Hadi, and I didn't see your mom. It was Wednesday, so it was a different day than I normally do.
She's comes sometimes and sometimes not.
Okay.
It's unpredictable. Don't take it personally.
All right, I'll try not to. Well, it's 6 o'clock. Got kind of a small crew tonight. But I am recording, so thanks everybody for coming. Welcome to the rise of the papacy. So you probably know the official history of the papacy, right? The Roman Church was founded by Peter and Paul. Peter is the first bishop of Rome, the first pope. And then Peter passed his leadership to Linus when he was executed by Nero in 64 AD. And Peter's apostolic authority has been passed on in an unbroken chain through the ages. So that's the official history, but now we're going to get the rest of the story. Hey, Pastor.
Or the real story.
So what I intend to cover over the next 4 weeks or so is the first section is I call popes and pagans. So we're going to start in 64 AD, which is the year Peter was crucified upside down by the Emperor Nero. And we're basically going to try and answer the question, how and why does the Bishop of Rome become preeminent among older churches, including Jerusalem? And then we're going to talk about the papacy's role in creating the medieval world after Rome falls. And really, the church is the one institution that survives the fall of Rome and becomes the organizing principle for a new civilization. And the papacy is going to be at the forefront of that. Episode 3, that's the good stuff that everybody wants to hear about. To the abyss and back, the papacy descends into the Dark Ages along with the rest of Europe, but then reforms itself to become the continent's preeminent power. And then I'm going to wrap up with kind of a retrospective that I call East versus West, the schism between Eastern and Western Christians that develops over centuries and largely over the question of papal power. So let's get started. And right off the bat, I'm going to tell you that the Roman Church was probably not founded by Peter and Paul. How do we know this? So even the Bible gives us evidence of this. In the book of Acts, we get an account of Paul running into a couple of Christians named Prisca and Aquila. He runs into them in Corinth, and they're described as Christian refugees from Rome. We're going to have more on that in a minute, okay? And at that point in the narrative of Acts, there is no mention prior to that of Paul going to Rome, okay, which would be a significant event that Luke, the author of Acts, would almost certainly want to record, okay? So we know there are refugees from Rome, and Paul has not been there.
Hold on.
Second piece of evidence, in his epistle to the Romans, it's pretty clear that Paul has never been to Rome. In fact, what he says to them, he's writing ahead, right? And he says in this letter, I have been longing for many years to visit you. I plan to do so when I go to Spain. And then later in chapter
Sending it to you
16.
right now.
Tim,
The
are
one that
you,
works.
can you hear
Okay.
me, Tim? We can hear you, Tim. I'm gonna mute Tim. In chapter 16, Paul lists a bunch of Romans that he's calling out by name, Roman Christians. And importantly, one of the people he doesn't name is Peter, right? So we know Paul hasn't been to Rome. He didn't found the Roman church. And at least by this point, Peter's not there. He's not acting as bishop of the Roman church. We're pretty sure that the Roman church had been established at least by the year 49 AD and probably somewhat earlier. Because in that year, we have an account that the Roman Emperor Claudius had to expel some Jews from Rome. And this is a Roman writer at the time who says they were expelled because of, quote, feuding over Christus, okay? So Christus, we're pretty sure, is Christ, right? And remember, this was Paul's way of converting the Jews to Christianity or getting converts. The place he would typically start, or where probably most of the missionaries would start, was at the Jewish synagogues. So they would try and work on the Jews, and it was very common then that that would cause dissension among the Jewish community. And that's apparently what happened in Rome. And so it's about that time that Paul arrives in Corinth, as we saw in Acts, and meets refugees from Rome, Prisca and Aquila, who apparently were among the Jews who the Emperor Claudius had expelled. Now, Peter and Paul may have organized an existing church, right? Acts itself ends with Paul in Rome. He's awaiting trial under kind of a loose house arrest. So we know he eventually gets there. And there is a strong early tradition that both apostles, Peter and Paul, were martyred there. And no other city claims to be the site of the martyrdom of either Peter or Paul, right? And in the early Christian period, that would be an important thing, right? If Peter had been martyred in your city or Paul, right, you're going to claim that. So very strong tradition that both Peter and Paul were martyred there and may have, you know, organized the church that already existed. So let's turn to the evolution of the idea of a church hierarchy itself. Why do we even have bishops? And in fact, in the earliest days, we didn't have bishops. In the earliest phase of Christianity, there were teachers rather than leaders among the Christian communities. And there was an expectation that the second coming was imminent, okay? Probably within months or just a couple of years. So they didn't really think about establishing a formal organization. They didn't think they were going to need a formal organization, right? But as time goes by and they realize that the second coming, you know, they don't know when it's going to be, and it may be in the very distant future, that's when they realize that they probably need to establish some kind of hierarchy, some kind of organization or leadership to keep the young church going. So we get into this interim phase where most churches are led by groups of elders, and the Greek word for elders is presbyters. So we get our word priest from this Greek word, and of course the Presbyterian church. This was really how the Jewish synagogues were organized. And again, Christianity's coming out of that Jewish milieu, so they're going to do what they know, what they remember. It's only in the final phase of this evolution that we start to see the emergence of a single monarchical leader, a bishop, okay? Some churches like Jerusalem under James had always followed this model, but most churches, we think, reached this point fairly late, okay? And why did we suddenly see the emergence of this office called bishop? Well, honestly, the impetus for the need for a strong authority was heretics. People with espousing different forms of Christianity, different beliefs claiming to be Christian. We kind of lump all these rival versions of Christianity together under the term Gnostic, okay? But it's not like you could come up with a consistent set of beliefs for the Gnostics. It's a whole bunch of different versions of Christianity, okay? But to give you an idea of how out there, how far away from the Christianity that we know some of these Gnostics were, I have a quote from one of the other versions of the gospel that were floating around, okay? This one's called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. So it was a gospel written about Jesus as a child, okay? And it's written by one of these alternative Gnostic sects who are claiming to be Christian, but as we're going to see, espousing completely different views of what that means. So in this Infancy Gospel of Thomas, this passage says, Jesus was going with his father Joseph, and someone running struck him in the shoulder. And Jesus said, "Cursed be you because of your leader." And immediately he died. So Jesus is a little kid. Somebody bumps into him, and Jesus uses his divine powers to strike that person dead, okay? And the gospel hilariously goes on to tell us that this kid's parents come and complain to Joseph and Mary about what Jesus has done, okay? So obviously a completely different idea of Christ and Jesus than what, we Orthodox Christians believe.
Okay.
So the Orthodox response to this proliferation of heresies is we need to invest authority in a single trustworthy leader. Every city needs to have a single trustworthy guy who can call it like it is and call out the heretics when they emerge and excommunicate them if necessary. And how are we going to ensure that we retain orthodoxy? Well, proof of your orthodoxy, number one, is that you're able to trace your line of succession back to one of the apostles, and you have to be accepted by other bishops. So the people in the Christians in a particular town will elect their bishop, but then other bishops have to come in and lay on hands, as we say, and thereby transmit the power of the Holy Spirit into the new person who's being consecrated as a bishop. And basically, they're going to give the good housekeeping seal of approval to this new candidate, right? If he's not Orthodox, these other bishops are not going to consecrate him, even if that's the will of the people in that town. So this is how the church is dealing with this problem of heresy and how the office of bishop comes along. So we know this is happening because around the year 150 AD, an ancient writer by the name of Hegesippus is troubled by the different versions of Christianity that he has encountered in his travels. He has seen some of these Gnostic heresies going on, and he wants to assure himself that there really is a true version of Christianity. And so what he decides to do is visit several of the most famous Christian churches, Christian cities. And the places that he goes, he compares their versions of Christianity to one another. And he says, yes, in these places that are famous, there is a common thread. I can detect a common version of Christianity. And with this idea of apostolic succession, he compiles succession lists of bishops in all these different towns to kind of satisfy himself that this is how they've inherited the true version of Christianity. For us historians, very frustrating. These lists are lost to us. Now, Rome is a latecomer to this concept of a monarchical church government. Now, how do we know that? Well, we know it from the writings of a guy named Ignatius of Antioch, who was a Christian bishop in the city of Antioch, which is in what is now Syria. And Ignatius sent to Rome for execution, much like Paul had been, 50 years earlier. And while he's being transferred to Rome, mostly through Turkey, he's writing letters to the churches along the way. And what he's telling them in these letters, which we have copies of, is be sure to obey your bishop. He keeps hammering home this idea, listen to your bishop, obey your bishop, do what your bishop says. And the fact that he keeps repeating this suggests to us that this whole idea of a bishop is a new thing, okay? That he has to remind people of this because it's not the norm yet, right? So around 125, we can detect this idea of the bishop as monarchical leader of a city coming into play. Now, remember, he's being transferred to Rome, so he writes ahead to Rome, and he names some people by name in his letter, but he doesn't mention a bishop, right? So with all his focus on obey your bishop, obey your bishop, obey your bishop, you would think if there was a bishop in Rome, he would be writing to that person. Later on, people are going to claim that there always were bishops in Rome. In fact, about 50 years-ish after Ignatius, we get Irenaeus of Lyon, which is in France. So Irenaeus is a bishop in France, and he's still battling heretics. Heresies are still going on, and Irenaeus writes a book called Against the Heresies. And then he visits Rome because it's a famously Orthodox city, right? It's one of the most prestigious places in the Christian world. And he obtains a succession list going back to St. Peter. So again, we've got to have that pedigree. We've got to have that unbroken chain from one of the apostles to whoever is bishop now. But this list is kind of suspicious. First of all, the number of bishops in this list that he compiles is 12, okay? Now that kind of raises suspicions because, right, 12 is kind of a magical biblical number, right? 12 tribes, Jesus' 12 chosen. Second suspicious thing is bishop number 6 in the list has the name Sixtus, which means sixth person, sixth son, okay? Romans, when they had big families, they'd give the first son the same name as the dad, maybe the second son would be named after an uncle. But you get down to 4, 5, 6, right? You run out of family names and you literally start naming them number 5, number 6, okay? And that's where this name Sixtus comes from. So the fact that our 6th pope is named Sixtus is cause for doubt, okay? And another list that comes out maybe 20 years later-ish has the same names in it, but they're in a different order, okay? So we're a little skeptical about Irenaeus's list. The probable reality is that there weren't bishops in Rome until about 150 AD. So 25 years after Ignatius was traveling to Rome. And the reasons for this, we think, are that, number one, the Christian community in Rome, which is the biggest city in the empire, okay, maybe 1 million people, the Christian community in that big city is too large and too widespread for a bishop to control, right? Now, keep in mind, Christianity is an illegal religion. In the eyes of the state, if you don't believe that the emperor is a god, that's treason, okay? So Christians are outlawed and they have to worship in secret. And the way that they're worshiping is in these private residences. There are these little house churches throughout the city of Rome, okay? So it would be very difficult for a single bishop to move about among all these different Christians in the city without drawing attention to himself and to the Christians in that city. So what we think was the case in Rome is that it was governed by a council of elders, right? Each of these little house churches probably had a leader, an elder, and these guys collectively led the church in the city of Rome. And that the bishops, quote unquote, in Irenaeus's list are probably notable elders from this period. Or in the case of Sixtus, some of them were probably made up to kind of fill a gap, okay? But again, the idea is we've got to prove that there was this unbroken chain of succession going back to an apostle. That's why they created this probable fake list of bishops. The probable first bishop, monarchical pope, leading the church in Rome was a guy named Anicetus around the year 150 AD. So let's talk about the early prestige of the Roman Church. Why are the popes going to become recognized as primary among all the bishops in the Roman Empire? Well, even when Paul was planning to visit Rome, Rome was already famous for the quality of its Christian community. In fact, in his epistle to the Romans, Paul says, "Your faith is being reported all over the world." He's noting it. I've heard it from many different places. And of course, we have that association with the super apostles, Peter and Paul, right? Peter in the Gospels is depicted as the leader of Jesus's 12 followers. And Paul is the author of more than half of the books in the New Testament. There was this early belief that they founded the Roman Church. And of course, it's undisputed that Rome was the site of their martyrdom. But beyond this, the Roman Church early on gains a reputation for charity, for helping struggling and emerging churches outside of Rome. Rome is the capital. We've got some very wealthy people there in the city, and some of them convert to Christianity. So there are some very wealthy Roman Christians. In fact, by the end of the first century, we know that some members of the imperial Flavian family have converted to Christianity. And there's even a Christian consul. Now, consul is an office that basically lost its meaning when the Roman Republic ended and the empire succeeded it, but it has been kept around as this ceremonial office. So to become a consul, you have to be recognized as an important person by the emperor himself. And one of the people that holds the ceremonial office, but still important, around the year 90 AD is a Christian. Irenaeus, the guy who gave us that list of 12 bishops, describes the Roman Church as the very great, very ancient, and universally known church. And then 70 years later, a bishop in Africa, Cyprian of Carthage, goes even one step further. He says, Rome is the primordial church, the very source of episcopal unity, whose faith was so proclaimed by the apostle. And he's referencing what Paul said there. The primordial church, the very source of episcopal unity. So by 250 AD, Rome is recognized as special. The Christian community in Rome is recognized as primordial, the original, the incubator of Christianity. Many early Christian luminaries make it a point to travel to Rome because the Christian community there is viewed with such esteem. We saw Irenaeus, but also early Christian writers like Justin, Polycarp, Origen, and even a famous Gnostic heretic named Marcion feel like they have to go to Rome to hear what the Romans have to say. So that's the prestige of the Roman Church, and there's an early document that really conveys to us the special nature, the special reverence in which the Roman Church is held. It's called the First Epistle of Clement. So what is this? The First Epistle of Clement is a letter written by the Roman Church anonymously to the church in Corinth. And what was happening in Corinth was that a younger faction had taken over the church there, and they had expelled several of the elders. Okay? They wanted to do a contemporary service, and so they got rid of all the old people that didn't want to do it. Who wrote this letter? Well, again, the letter itself is anonymous, but it is traditionally ascribed to a guy named Clement of Rome. And in those early succession lists, Clement is number 3 in the succession list. So he's one of these guys who gets tagged as one of Peter's successors as Pope. In an early document called the Shepherd by an ancient Christian writer named Hermas, he's the one who attributes this letter, this epistle, to a guy named Clement. Now, Clement was probably a prominent elder, because remember, we don't think there was a bishop of Rome around this time. He was probably a prominent elder, perhaps charged with, quote, foreign affairs, dealing with external churches. So when was this letter written? We think around the year 96 AD. That's when it has traditionally been dated because there are references in the letter to, quote, sudden misfortunes. And these sudden misfortunes, we think, are a persecution that flared up under the Emperor Domitian. And if this was when it was written, it could be about the same time that the book of Revelation is being written, okay? Around the year 100 AD, again, possibly Revelation was being written during Domitian's persecution, and that's why so many references to Rome as the beast. Most importantly, what is the significance of this epistle of Clement? It is the first evidence we have of Roman involvement in another church's affairs. For the first time, we have concrete evidence that the church in Rome is being asked for help by another church or offering to help, offering guidance to another church, that Rome itself is exerting some kind of authority over other Christians outside of its borders. And this letter was actually viewed as scripture by some early Christians. Now, it didn't make it into the New Testament because the bishops, when they compiled the New Testament, determined that it wasn't apostolic in its origin, but early on, it kind of carried the same weight among early Christian communities. The first time that we really start to see the Roman Church kind of take that step forward where they're going beyond offering guidance and trying to assert authority comes about as a result of a controversy over Easter. So the question is, when exactly do we celebrate Easter? Do we celebrate it on the same date every year, according to the Jewish calendar, which would be 14 Nisan, Passover? Right? The Gospel of John suggests that's when Jesus's resurrection happened. So we should always celebrate it on that same date. Or should we celebrate it on Sunday every year? Because the Gospels also tell us that Jesus was resurrected on a Sunday. So some churches are sticking with the original, we're always going to do it on the 14th of Nisan. Other churches are saying we're going to do it on the first Sunday after Passover. The churches that celebrate it on 14 Nisan come to be called Quartodecimanians, which literally means 14ers, okay? So the 14ers are the guys who celebrate it on 14 Nisan, and there are other churches, including Rome, who have adopted the practice of celebrating it on the Sunday after Passover. So remember, our first pope, we think, was this guy named Anicetus. And about the year 150 AD, a bishop from Asia Minor, from Turkey, a guy named Polycarp of Smyrna, pays a visit to Rome, right? Because that's what you do, right? You try and go to Rome. And he visits his counterpart, Bishop Anicetus of Rome. And each of them tries to convert the other on which date we should use to celebrate Easter. The Pope is trying to convince Polycarp to celebrate it the Sunday every year. Polycarp is saying, no, we need to celebrate it on 14 Nisan. They finally agree to disagree. Neither of them can convert one another, but importantly, Pope Anicetus lets this visiting bishop lead services out of respect, and they part as friends. They're not going to let this issue divide them. Okay? But a generation later, we get a new pope, a guy named Victor, who's going to take a very different approach. Around the year 190 AD, we get a bunch of these local synods where groups of bishops who are in proximity to one another, they get together and they discuss various issues. And they get together and they discuss this issue of when do we celebrate Easter, right? We've all got to be on the same page. And several of these synods, particularly in the West, decide in favor of the Sunday practice. We're gonna celebrate Easter the Sunday after 14 Nisan. And so after the Roman Synod, which Victor, the Pope at that time, presides at, after his synod says, yes, we're always gonna celebrate Easter on a Sunday, he writes a letter to a counterpart in Asia and orders, this is the important word, orders the Asian churches to fall in line, right? Very different than how Pope Anicetus had handled things. Let's see if we can convince each other. Now we've got the Pope ordering these other bishops to fall in line. And when they don't, he excommunicates the churches in Asia. And very importantly, this brings down a bunch of calumny on Victor's head. Other bishops from all over, even bishops who agree with the substance that we should celebrate Easter on a Sunday, they rebuke Victor and say, this is not the way to handle it. You don't have the authority to excommunicate these other Christians over this issue. So Victor is forced to back down. But what we see here is really the first effort by the popes to exert authority over other churches. So after this, quick historical digression here, we have what is called the 3rd century crisis in the Roman Empire, and it lasts for about 50 years in the middle of the 3rd century. What's happening during this 3rd century crisis is it seems like the Roman Empire is collapsing. We've got barbarians who are breaching the borders and running rampage inside the Roman Empire. We've got whole provinces of the Roman Empire breaking away and declaring themselves to be independent. And we've got a very unstable government at the top, 25 emperors in this 50-year period. So emperors rise up and then get overthrown almost as quickly. And it's right smack dab in the middle of this crisis that a very important event happens. Rome's 1000th birthday, 247 AD, right? The Romans believed their city was founded in 753 BC. Rome is going to turn 1000 this year in 247 AD. And this causes a crisis of confidence. Remember, it's in the middle of this period of decline, and the emperors at that time think, we inherited this great thing that was built by our forefathers, and look what we've done with it. Look at what has happened. And the emperor who comes to power is a general named Decius. Decius is feeling very guilty about the decline, the sorry state of the Roman Empire on its 1000th birthday. And he decides that the solution is we're going to mollify Rome's traditional gods. The gods are mad at us, And that's why we're not prospering. So we're going to go back to the good old Roman religion and get the gods on our side. So he forces all citizens to make pagan sacrifices. And if you refuse, which a lot of Christians would have to do, right? Because they only recognize the one true God, that refusal is punishable by imprisonment, torture, or even death. You could be executed. And so what happens as a result of the Decian persecution is that we get a lot of Christian martyrs, people who are killed because they won't knuckle under and worship the pagan gods. We also get confessors, people who suffer for the faith rather, but they're not executed. Maybe they're tortured, maybe they're thrown in jail. But on the flip side, martyrs and confessors are the heroes, but on the other side, we have apostates, people who bend and they do sacrifice to the pagan gods. And we have traditores, people who hand over the Christian scriptures. That's what traditore means. It's Latin for hand over. And traditores is where we get our word traitors from. So, in the aftermath of this persecution, the Christian church has got a real problem. How do we deal with these apostates and these traditores? And there's two different camps on how to deal with the traditores and the apostates. There's the hardliners who say, nope, no reconciliation. They're not going to be allowed back into the Christian church. They're excommunicated. They made their choice. They are not welcome. But most of the church, including the Roman church, takes a more moderate view that people who had knuckled under pressure during the persecution can be allowed back into the church after they've done penance as prescribed by their local bishop. So each bishop will decide what is appropriate based on the facts of the case. And this question of, do we take a hard line or do we allow for a way for these apostates to return, plays into the idea of papal authority. So we have a church in Spain, a couple of them in fact, where the bishops themselves were accused of sacrificing to the pagan gods. And after the persecution is over, their congregations expel these bishops. So they're deposed by their congregations. And these two bishops then appeal to the church in Rome. And Pope Stephen, again, the Roman church is taking a more moderate line. Pope Stephen orders these churches in Spain to reinstate their bishops. Take them back, let them be your bishop again, figure out a way to move forward. Now, if the popes had recognized universal authority, which clearly these bishops think they have something, right? Because they appealed to the Roman church. But the congregations don't take the papal order as final. When they get the word from the Pope to put these guys back, they just appeal to a different church, the church in Africa, and basically a council of bishops in Africa. And the Africans, led by Cyprian of Carthage, remember him, the guy that had described the Roman church as the primordial church, he upholds the original expulsion. So, what do we learn from this episode, right? Clearly, there's an idea that the Roman Church has some kind of special authority or esteem or prestige worthy of appealing to it, but it's definitely not absolute, right? Because if you get an answer you don't like from Rome, that's not the end of the story. We'll just go somewhere else. We have a similar affair in Gaul. A bishop of Arles is a hardliner. Okay, he's not allowing any apostates back into his church. And other Gallic bishops complain in vain to Pope Stephen, and then finally to Cyprian of Carthage. And Cyprian writes sternly to the Pope, admonishing him to intervene. And again, not a suggestion that the Pope has direct power, but more evidence that the Pope has moral authority and influence. Another question that comes out of this persecution is, are baptisms performed by a heretic or by a lapsed bishop valid? Okay. The African church takes a hard line on this. No, if it turns out your bishop is a heretic and you were baptized by that bishop, you have to be rebaptized. Your baptism was not valid. The Roman policy is the opposite. The Roman policy is the baptism itself is still valid because when you're baptized, it's the Holy Spirit at work in that sacrament. And that's the case even if the human agent is imperfect, okay? The church as a whole is divided fairly evenly, but here again, we're going to see the popes trying to assert their authority. So we get Cyprian down in Carthage. Remember, he's a hardliner. No, the baptism is not valid. You have to be baptized again. He writes to the Pope, and he's basically telling the Pope, you need to do it our way. You're wrong, Bishop of Rome. And this is the guy who had called the Roman Church the primordial church, okay? The Pope knows that this delegation of Africans is going to come and demand this, so he refuses to meet with them and also orders all of the people in the Roman Church, don't even give them hospitality. We don't even want to deal with these people. And he replies to Cyprian, the African church must conform to Roman practice, or there will be no communion between our two churches. And the Pope also writes to other bishops trying to line up support for his side in this dispute. So Cyprian, the guy who had earlier described the Roman Church as the primordial church, the very source of episcopal unity, he now describes the Bishop of Rome as, quote, a friend to heretics. And another bishop in Asia, who is taking the same position as Cyprian, puts it even more pointedly. Talking about the Pope, he says, he who brags so loudly that he holds the succession from Peter is introducing many other rocks. Now, what is this all about? Well, what we're seeing here is what is called the Petrine theory. And this is the theory that popes like Stephen and like Victor before him are going to use as the basis for this special papal authority. And it all goes back to the 16th chapter of Matthew. Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" And it was Simon Peter that answered and said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." So Jesus asks his followers, "Who do you think I am?" And it's Simon who says, "You're the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered and said unto him, "Blessed art thou, Simon Barjona," because that was Peter's name before he got changed. "Blessed art thou, Simon, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven. And I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Very important passage. Jesus not only gives Simon a new name, the rock, and says, "You're the rock on which I'm going to build my church," I'm giving you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And of course, who is the apostolic successor to Peter? The bishops of Rome. So this is the doctrinal basis for papal supremacy. Jesus entrusted power over the church to Peter. Peter, in turn, entrusted that power first to Linus, and then in that line of apostolic succession, all the popes that follow. The fact that it's Peter has a couple of benefits. Unlike Paul, Peter left very few writings, right? Paul, we have a lot of writings, at least attributed to Paul. So you can pin down Paul's beliefs on lots of different issues. But Peter's kind of an open book. And that gives the popes a lot more latitude, okay? Peter's power, and thus the pope's power, is more personal than theological or scriptural. About this time, we get independent secular evidence that the power of the papacy is starting to become recognized as something special. And it's ironic, it comes at the hands of a Roman emperor, Emperor Aurelian, who ruled at the end of that period of chaos from 270 to 275. And what happens is you get a bishopric rather, a city where two men are claiming to be the rightful bishop of that city. They want to be bishop and they want power over the property that the church in that city owns and controls. And this property dispute, because it's not just a matter of who's the rightful bishop, but who's in control of the lands and property this church owns, ends up making its way to the emperor. He's going to decide this issue. And Aurelian says, whoever the Bishop of Rome recognizes as the rightful bishop is the rightful bishop. So again, we get this early indication that the bishops of Rome have this kind of special esteem. This is where I'm going to end it for tonight. And I've been asked in the comments I've gotten on this class to set aside some time at the end of each session to answer questions. We got a little over 5 minutes. If anybody has any questions about what I covered tonight before we move on. Fred?
Remember when you said that the emperors came and went on the average of every 2 years? I just was curious, how many, or what percentage of those were just executed?
Well, a very high percentage, in fact, yes, it was, you didn't have a high probability of dying happily in your bed if you became emperor during this period. So,
That's
yes,
what I suspect.
yes. Thought I was, yeah, Mark.
Mike, why do you think Aurelian made that decision?
Again, I think it was because he kind of had this idea that I know something about the Christians and their leader seems to be this Bishop of Rome, right? So an important indication that, you know, even though Christianity is this outlawed religion, right? They're known to the emperors, and more importantly, the kind of special position of the Bishop of Rome is known. Now, maybe his advisors told him that this is the case, but it's interesting that, you know, in the imperial government, you know, even though the Christians are viewed as illegal, right? They even have this kind of concept that, okay, among the Christians, the Bishop of Rome seems to have some kind of special position. I didn't see if anybody out in Zoom land had any
Yep.
questions.
Mike, it's Clark. I do have a question.
Yeah.
Going back to your Easter dates, what was 14 Nissan? If that was a date.
Yeah, so
Do you know where that is?
yeah, so the Jews have a lunar calendar. Okay, so you know, we have a solar calendar. Their calendar tracks with the moon rather than the sun. And so one of their months is called Nisan, right? And that's why Passover and why Easter are, you know, different dates in our calendar every year, right?
Right.
But in their calendar, it's Passover is always on the same date in their lunar calendar. Yeah,
Okay.
good question. Sorry, I didn't
Makes
make
sense. Yeah. Thank you. Fascinating.
All right, well, if there are no other questions, I'll let you go a couple of minutes early. Thank you so much for turning out tonight and tuning in. Appreciate it. And we'll be back next week to pick up the story with the conversion of Constantine, and everything is going to change for the papacy when the Roman emperors embrace Christianity.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mike.
Take care.
Hmm.